Hi, I'm Bruce Williams. This is Chamber Chats. I'm the CEO of the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce, and I would like to begin, as always, by acknowledging that I live and work on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking Coast Salish nations, in particular the Songhees and the Esquimalt. Chamber Chats is made possible through the support of Island Savings, a division of First West Credit Union, and we do it all, as always, here in the podcasting studios at Czech Television. Something that we don't see and hear on Vancouver Island the way we used to are trains. And as we take a look at our transportation options up and down the island to move goods and services around and people, what is the future of trains? We're going to find out. Larry Stevenson is my guest. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Island Corridor Foundation. Larry, welcome to Chamber Chats.
Thanks. Good to be here with you, Bruce.
So let's remind people, who are you guys?
Well, the Island Corridor Foundation is the organization that actually holds all of the rail assets on Vancouver Island. So that's a length of track that goes from Victoria all the way up to Courtenay, and then it goes across from Parksville over to Port Alberni. So it's a total of about 290 kilometers of track.
Is there a little bit in Cowichan too?
Well, down to Lake Cowichan,
Yeah.
That's a path. So that's been turned into a trail.
Okay.
It's not been commissioned. It's not operating as a railroad.
So it's been a few years now since we had train service on Vancouver Island.
Mm-hmm.
The reason was maintenance, correct? It was the state of the track. Tell me about that.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, if you go through the history, I mean, the line was never really well maintained, starting back in probably 1990s. CP was kind of in a bit of a hurry to get out of here. And yeah, the track deteriorated over a period of time until I got to a point in 2011 where it was determined that it probably wasn't a good idea to continue with passenger service on the line. So the decision was made, rightly so, I think, by our partners at Southern Rail and ourselves to discontinue service. So the service was actually shut down in 2011.
So Southern Rail is the company that actually operated the train, but you guys hold the track. Is that right?
Correct. Southern Rail, SVI, is our partner. They are contracted to us to actually operate the railroad. And in fact, today they do operate a railroad in Nanaimo. I'm not sure if your listeners are aware, but a good portion of the propane that comes to this island actually comes in by rail.
Okay. Yeah, because I was actually in Nanaimo a few months ago, and I heard the whistle on that train. I was up near Nanaimo Golf Club, and it was just really it was bizarre to hear a train and see a train going, wow, it's been a long time. You see them on the mainland, you see them across Canada, but you just don't see them around here much anymore. So you talk about the condition of the track not being kept up by CP. How did that come to be, or why was that? They didn't want to do it anymore?
Well, I think if you go back through time, I mean, as the railroads, as the main railroads got bigger and bigger, of course, these small operations, and certainly the island was a small operation, they were trying to divest themselves of those operations. The big line CP, CN, they're not really well positioned to take care of these kind of lines. It's more of a short line operation, and it has to have the mentality of a short line. So, CP, again, they were trying to get off the island. And I think that, over the course of a number of years, as the traffic dwindled, it got harder and harder to maintain. It got harder and harder to put that capital forward to keep it up to a point where it should have been kept up to. So, over the course of the number of years, it just deteriorated.
So we are actually recording this during the week of the weather episode that resulted in us suddenly realizing we are once again being threatened with a challenge to our supply chain. Yeah. Let's talk in terms, first of all, of this rail bed at some point returning as a part of freight, not just passenger trains. But what's the likelihood of that right now?
Oh, it's in my mind, it's very good. There's always the question of what is this railroad going to do, or what can it do? And I think there was an article that was written by Jack Knox that talked about, whether or not this railroad could carry freight. And in fact, it can. And, that's part of the design. Going forward, what we're looking for is four things. We're looking for commuter rail. We're looking for interregional trains. We're looking for excursion trains. And we're also looking for freight. The lion's share of that freight's likely going to come through Port Alberni. It's likely going to go to Nanaimo and to the mainland, but there's no reason why we can't handle freight to places, up and down the line, like Top Shelf Feeds here in Duncan. They get most of their feed by rail today.
This is where I ask some dumb questions, but I'm going to do it anyway because that's very often how you get to the point. If we have one rail line, how can all those different services run on it at the same time?
It's timing. It's a question we get a lot. A lot of folks think that in order to be efficient, you have to have a double track, and you don't. If you look at CN as an example, I would suggest to you that probably less than 40% of their track is actually double track. You plan for it, and you run the trains around what you have. And we do have sidings up and down the island, and we do have land available to build sidings if we need to increase it. So you're just timing the trains, and that's going to hold true whether it's an interregional train or a freight train or a commuter train.
Where are those sidings?
Oh, they're all up and down the island.
Yeah.
I guess the closest one in Victoria, is going to be right down by the Esquimalt Nation. There's a big siding in there as an example. There's room to build sidings in other locations on the line, like by right downtown. We could put another siding in. There's a double track already there, in fact.
And you talk about the one part of the track in Cowichan being converted over into trails. There's the E&N Trail in the Capital Region. There's other
Correct.
trails around. What sort of percentage or portion of the bed has been converted into trails?
Well, that's kind of two different things.
Okay.
So the trail that goes down to Cowichan, that is the actual rail bed that has been converted into a trail. So there's no rail there, there's no operation, and there's no thought about bringing it back, although it could in the future if we needed to do that. When you talk about the E&N Trail that exists today in the CRD, and it's up here in the CVRD and in other locations, Nanaimo, that is a trail that is built beside the track. And it's always been the ICF's goal to have trails along the entire corridor, and there's no reason why we can't. Certainly with the active transportation move that we see taking place today, it would make sense. And that the people at the CRD will tell you that trail is extremely well used.
I use it myself, actually.
Yeah, it's hundreds of thousands of people a year, or trips per year, that go across that trail. So it's a very well used asset.
We're going to deal with a couple of elephants in the room next. One is a court case, and the other is money. We're talking today with Larry Stevenson on Chamber Chats. He's the CEO of the Island Corridor Foundation, who are the people that hold the rail beds up and down Vancouver Island. So it's no secret that there's been some legal matters, a lot of them involving a couple of nations, First Nations on the island. Where's that at?
So I think, for the benefit of your listeners, we've been engaged in litigation with one nation in particular since 2015. And, that case has been heard now. It was heard here in BC at the Supreme Court. And the case was dismissed. It was then appealed, and it was dismissed again by the appeals court just actually in September of this year. So what was clear coming out of those legal cases is that the corridor has to be used for railway purposes. And Bruce, you and I have talked in the past about the notion that, we've heard, let's turn it into a bus lane, let's turn it into something else. And the fact is we can't, and the courts have made that clear. And the reason for that is because, as they put in the court case, the land was taken. It was taken for railway purposes, and therefore it must remain that way, or it could be subject to going back to the First Nations. So that's really what came out of that. Now, one of the interesting things about the appeal, usually when an appeals court, at least I'm told by our lawyers, when an appeals court rules, what they do is they say, this is our ruling, it's either dismissed or it's not. In this particular case, they came out and they said, okay, it's dismissed, but we have a few conditions that we want to apply. With the key one being that the federal government must step up, and they need to make a determination within the next 18 months whether or not this corridor is in the public interest. They also need to determine whether or not they're going to fund infrastructure improvements on the northern portion of the line, and they have to do that within 18 months. And the reason why it's being directed at the federal government, I mean, you kind of have to go back through the history. The land was taken, and there was a land grant, the E&N land grant, which I think most folks are aware of, back in the late 1800s, that really started the railroad. And it was the federal government that granted that land to the Dunsmuirs to build the railroad. And that was a 20-mile swath of land that went completely up the side of the island, took about 20% of the island. Today, that swath of land is 100 feet, but when the land was taken, it was taken by the federal government. Therefore, the court has come out and said the federal government needs to deal with this issue. And by the way, we've been saying that as well. We've been saying it for some time, that our senior levels of government need to get involved. They need to address this issue if we ever have any hope of moving this forward.
There is a reconciliation element to this, of course. The nations, as you say, the land was taken from them, and they would like it back. So these decisions are contentious at best, right?
Well, they are. And, I think they're indicative of a level of frustration with our First Nations. I mean, when you look at the history of the ICF was actually put forward by the Cowichan tribes. It was at their suggestion that the ICF be formed to ensure that we maintain this corridor, because they want to make sure that those connections are maintained between their nations. Very important to them. And, this was a promise in 2003 that we were going to restore rail service and there would be some benefit to our First Nations. And here we are. It's 2021. We've not delivered on that promise. And in fact, we're still hung up on it. So there's a level of frustration with our First Nations to say, look, let's use it or lose it. Let's get on with this and let's make a decision. And I think, with the court ruling, that's going to happen now. It has to happen now. We don't have a choice at this point, which I think is a good thing.
So the one nation that's involved in this litigation, are the other nations supporting them or are they supporting you?
Well, so what happened is, a couple of the other nations also filed at the same time, and their cases were put into abeyance pending the outcome of this particular case, because it doesn't make sense to have three going at the same time, because the essence of those are all the same. So the issues are being dealt with through the one case. Now, when you say, do they support it? I think all the First Nations support the idea that it's time. It's time to make a decision. Do they all support rail? I think some do, some don't, and that's fair enough. But I think the biggest hurdle we have right now is that we need to get moving. We need to move forward, and we need to demonstrate the value of this for our First Nations partners.
Is there some opportunity that as the rail line runs through various nations, of course, is there a revenue piece for them in that?
Well, and that's one of the conversations that is happening now, because we have to ask the questions of our First Nations. What part do you want to play? Do you want to be a passive investor type person that's going to receive a dividend, or do you want to play a role in the actual operation of the rail line? And, lately we've been having discussions about setting up a completely First Nations owned and operated railroad. And there's no reason why we can't do that. There's one that exists in northern Quebec today. But again, it's, that's a decision for our First Nations. It's not a decision for me or for you or anybody else. Our First Nations have to look at that, and they have to see that value. So those discussions are starting now. Frankly, I think it's a great idea. In an era of reconciliation, the ICF is reconciliation. Our board is 50% First Nations, 50% regional districts. If you can put a regional railroad into play that's owned and operated by First Nations, I think that's a win all the way around.
So let's go back to the money from the feds right now,
Sure.
our money from our federal government. Could it be, certainly the trail remediation would be funded by that money, but would there also be money to, for example, again, provide revenue to the nations as sort of almost a lease arrangement that we're going to have this rail bed running through your line and here's some money for that?
Well, again, I mean, it depends on what they want. Do they want to have a passive approach to this? Because, running a railroad is not, for everybody, and they may not have an interest in that. If they choose not to, as a passive investor type relationship, collecting a dividend, yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be money there. Is it something the government has to pay? I don't know that yet. There's going to be a lot of puts and takes here, and we're going to have to determine exactly what this railroad can do, and from there determine what's going to be available to our partners.
If I recall correctly, rail service was a condition of British Columbia entering Confederation of Canada.
Yeah.
Does that apply to Vancouver Island, and is that a contravention then of that agreement? That
No.
We don't have rail.
No, not anymore. The court ruled a number of years ago that the stipulation that rail must exist no longer is at play. So although it was part of the British North American Act, today it has no bearing.
Okay. Next, we're going to get to the really big thing, and that's the money. Chamber Chat today is with Larry Stevenson, the CEO of the Island Corridor Foundation. So first of all, let's talk about the remediation of the trail bed. So Larry, I was of the understanding at one time that it was all or nothing. Like you have to do the entire track, north to south, east to west. Is that still the case?
No, and it never really was.
Okay.
I mean, I think where you got that from, Bruce, was conversations that we've had in the past about, the province was talking about doing only a commuter service in the CRD. And our viewpoint was that, look, that's well and fine, but we need to talk about the rest of the island. We can't just abandon the rest of the island just to do a CRD product. And I think from there, that kind of grew into this idea that, well, we have to have all of it. We're not going to do any of it. I think, if you go forward with this to develop this line, it's going to have to be done in pieces anyway. So, you start where the need is the greatest. And I think it's arguably that need is in the CRD today for a commuter system. But then there's also an interregional system that needs to get built. We've got people that are coming from Duncan into Victoria. We've got people that are going from Nanaimo into Victoria. So that has to be addressed as well. And, if you're going to mobilize crews to come over here and do it, you may as well do it. There's no point in doing half of it.
Yeah, so let's take a look at the whole thing. If all of the rail bed was to be remediated at once, what's the cost?
In our view, it's probably around $350 million. Now, You probably recall that when this was released, when the assessment was released, the province did an assessment to determine the cost. They came out with a number of $1.3 billion. And that's the one that, of course, made all the headlines.
Right.
But when you look at that, when you get inside that number, they put as an example $575 million in there for a standalone commuter system that would operate only from Langford to Victoria for $575 million that involved running 24 commuter trains per day, which is clearly something we don't need today. We just don't have the people to do that, and we don't need to do that. We can do something much smaller. So, we took a look at it. Also inside those numbers, they have a 97% contingency cost as an example, which, is really unheard of. We were rather taken aback when we saw that. And we've since shared it with a number of engineers, and they kind of had the same view. So if you remove all of that noise, we think we can deliver a small commuter system for the CRD, which would likely entail, heavy rush hour traffic in the morning, heavy rush hour traffic in the afternoon, and then a couple of trains through the day. It's not going to be an all day going like an LRT system that you see in some of the bigger cities. It would also deliver interregional trains. We could run trains from Victoria to Courtenay and back, plus excursion trains, for doing the tourism end of it. And of course, the freight trains. And, I think you're going to have a system there that's going to work, and it's going to work well. And this is in keeping with what they already had in the assessment. We agreed with the numbers that the government put forward. All we did is we took them and we kind of refined them. And $350 million, let's make no mistake, that's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a tremendous amount of money. But in the bigger scheme of things, they're spending $350 million to go 1 kilometer on the mainland. In their rail projects over there. We're going to do 290 kilometers for $350 million.
So why is there such a difference in cost?
Probably because on the mainland, they have to get land acquisition costs built in. They're going through urban areas. They're going to have to buy up property. They're going to have to move utilities. They're going to have to do all of that stuff. We have an existing rail bed today. All we really need to do is upgrade it.
So as I mentioned earlier, you and I are recording this a few days after the weather incident that came along and impacted the Malahat. What happened, because there's rail beds on the mainland that have been compromised by this storm. What about on the island corridor?
Well, surprisingly enough, and kind of ironically, the 135-year-old rail bed has stood up to the extent that the only thing we had was a very minor slide that's going to take about 4 hours for us to fix. Other than that, if we'd had the rail system in place, it would have been open today. But, I want to be clear. I don't want to leave anybody with the idea that we think, we could have solved all the problems over the Malahat. We can't. But we do provide an option that can be available to people. And, if we were in operation today, we would still be operating through the weather event.
Yeah. Where was your little compromise on the track?
Just south of Duncan.
Okay.
And it was really just a mudslide. It came down over the tracks. There's some trees in it. We just need to get some equipment. Matter of fact, the equipment is in there today as we speak, cleaning that up.
Okay. I want to go back to the idea of bringing it in from Langford into Victoria. So when the old Blue Bridge was replaced with what's now in place, a rail bed was not included in that to bring the trains across the water into the downtown area. How would that be impacted now? Like, where would the trains terminate, and how would you get those people further to where they need to go?
Well, it would terminate within probably 100 yards of the Johnson Street Bridge. As it stands today, it terminates there. It terminates down by the BMW dealership down there on the water. And, a lot of people point to that and say, oh, well, this is never going to work. Who's going to, get on that train if it can't go into downtown? And, I kind of look at it and say, well, in the age of active transportation, it's not a very far walk. It's going to take you 10 minutes. If you're further away, you should marry this thing up with a bus system. And, quite frankly, if we don't marry it up to buses and we don't integrate it with transit, it's not going to work. I mean, it's clear that we have to have integration with transit throughout the island, and that would be part of the plan.
There would be people with mobility issues too that have to be transported around from the train to somewhere else too. So has that site in Vic West been determined as to where that could be?
No, I mean, today we have the railhead. The railhead is there. It's in existence today, and there's room there to actually build a platform and to put it in there. I think down the line, if we start talking about 30 or 40 years from today, there has to be a thought given to taking it across the river. And there has to be thought with, expanding a system that goes all the way out to the airport.
So we're moving goods around on the island right now by truck, and rail would then come along and provide a freight service to either augment that or replace some of that. What's that likelihood?
It's very good. It's very high. Particularly if you look at the situation we find ourselves in today with greenhouse gas emissions and, the need to start cutting back and doing those things. I mean, you can take one carload as an example of paper and you can take 4 trucks off the road. And that's 4 trucks that aren't just here on the island. That's 4 trucks that go all the way to market. So if you're taking, 4 carloads of paper, 4 truckloads of paper to California, you're putting it in one boxcar. So, the chances are actually very good. And if you talk to people like Top Shelf Feeds and Duncan, who are reliant upon rail, they very much want to see this railroad running because they want that product coming right to their door in Duncan, as opposed to transloading it in Nanaimo, which is what they're doing today. So the prospects are very good.
What have the truckers got to say about that? Have you heard from them?
No, and frankly,
You might now.
I might now. I think there's enough business to go around for everybody. I mean, again, the railroad doesn't answer everything. The railroad is not going to be a panacea. We don't view it that way. It's going to provide us with the options we need to go forward, and I think that's going to be critically important in the future.
How green or how environmentally friendly or non-carbon emitting can trains be in the future?
Well, they can be zero. They can be zero emitting. I mean, the technology exists today. There's a lot of programs taking place now. A number of universities, as an example, where they're exploring all different kinds of technology, hydrogen, electricity. It really depends on how much you want to spend. But if as an example, we wanted to move tomorrow and we were going to put the train in, it would likely be a diesel locomotive that's going to do it. But I don't want people to get the idea we're talking about the old stinky, great big locomotive. We're talking about a very efficient system today that, is going to produce greenhouse gases at a rate of about 1/3 of a car. So, we need to be doing this. I mean, if we are serious about modal shift, which is probably the only way we're going to get to the greenhouse gas targets we need to do, we can't rely on buses. We can't think the buses are going to be the answer. I'm a transit supporter, but it's not the only answer. We need to find ways to shift a lot of people, and trains deliver that.
Larry Stevenson is the Chief Executive Officer of the Island Corridor Foundation. Larry, thanks for your time and all the information. We appreciate it.
Thanks. Always good to be here.
You bet. Check out their website and get more information about them. And that's it for this time around. I'm Bruce Williams. We'll see you again for another Chamber Chat.